And here it is.
Russia is once again in the crosshairs.
Well, now there will be a big bang, a huge one. It won't be pretty. It's taking it down. There it goes, there it goes.
A blackout Russian style. Russian aviation dropped bombs on a substation in Belgorod.
The city was left without power. The authorities are lying about an unidentified munition, but people heard the roar of a fighter jet before the explosion.
The Ukrainian armed forces are terrorizing Russians behind the lines. Ryazan is shaking. The oil refinery is ablaze. A slap in the face to Putin. Turkey is refusing Russian S-400 systems.
Erdogan's government is taking this step to unblock access to purchasing the latest American F-35 fighter jets.
Russia's aircraft fleet is dwindling. The occupiers have lost nearly 800 fighter jets.
The beginning of last winter became a black month for aviation. At that time, an A-50 and an airborne command post were shot down over the Sea of Azov.
East. Meanwhile, the occupiers are moving towards this direction. Elite unit. There are no results yet, thank God, but we understand that they will continue to do this because Putin needs a pretty picture. By the way, a beautiful picture on the territory of the Russian Federation itself. It is the armed forces of Ukraine that are providing Putin with that beautiful picture. There have been more strikes in Engels. This time, friendly drones attacked an oil depot. There is more bad news for the Russian occupiers. F-16 fighter jets now in service with Ukraine have likely started shooting down Russian Shaheds using inexpensive and effective missiles. What is this new development? And not only that, details in the report after our exclusive studio discussion.
Drones in Russia's Engels. There are an airfield and an oil depot belonging to the occupiers there. Drones also reached Volgograd, causing a strong reaction among local residents.
What are you talking about?
For 13.
There are people affected here, but no problems are arising.
The occupiers near the Belgorod border are not sleeping peacefully. While Ukrainians are attacking Russian military targets, the latter in turn continue to shell peaceful Ukrainian civilians. This video shows the aftermath of the nighttime attack on Chernihiv, Ukraine. Russian troops attacked Okhturka in the Sumy region. Hits were recorded on the roof and wall of one of the apartments in a 9-story building. Meanwhile, American President Donald Trump, who has taken it upon himself to mediate between Russia and Ukraine, claims that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is allegedly not ready to accept a peace plan, if it can even be called that.
According to the legislation of the United States of America, adopted back in 2017 during Trump's presidency and signed by Trump himself, the US will not recognize any territories that Russia has annexed from Ukraine since 2014. Because once again, there is a corresponding law. In other words, if you want to do what's written in this plan to recognize Russian territory, first you need to change your domestic legislation. Your own law forbids you from doing this. So here, not only is the initiator of the proposal external and without the expertise of the State Department and Congress, it's illegal, but even the proposals within these very points themselves, they also contradict US law.
There's a clear example of how Trump knows how to make deals. After the conflict was settled by the US president, clashes broke out on the border between Thailand and Cambodia. Numerous murders, rapes, and other crimes in the African country of Mali are being committed by militants from the African Corps, which is subordinate to the Russian Ministry of Defense. And it replaced Wagner. Accordingly, knowing the treachery of the Russians, no one can guarantee that Ukraine won't face a repeat of the conflict.
No one can provide us with any other security guarantee more effective than strengthening Ukraine's defense forces. So the only thing we can do, specifically in the context of security guarantees, is to strengthen our army, not reduce it. And in terms of peace, we see that there are calls to reduce the Ukrainian army.
The son and namesake of the American president, Donald Trump Jr., does not rule out that his father may distance himself from Russia's war against Ukraine if attempts to achieve peace are unsuccessful.
Russia supports peace talks only for one purpose: to persuade the US to stop further aid to Ukraine, and at the very least to minimize it. Because the war that Russia was expected primarily in Russia itself, but also in the West, to win in 4 days to capture Kyiv and all of Ukraine in 2 months has now been going on for almost 4 years. And to say that Russia is achieving success would be far, far too optimistic for Russia.
The so-called conquerors are going into Ukraine barefoot and barehanded, and they're the ones saying this themselves.
3.5 years of war. Can we really not centrally supply our army with underwear and socks?
Apparently, the Russian command simply doesn't see the point in spending money on their soldiers who are eliminated almost instantly. And to cover up the losses of the dead, they are listed as deserters. Partisans are the ones reporting this. Despite the problems in Vovchansk, Siversk, Mirnohrad, and Pokrovsk caused by the intense pressure from Russian troops, Donbas is holding on, according to Ukrainian war correspondents. Kupiansk is being shelled, but it still stands. Here, the Russian army is also taking a beating from the Ukrainian armed forces.
Next, we're speaking with Alexander Kovalenko, a military analyst who is joining us. Alexander, hello, it's good to see you.
Good evening.
The first question has remained the same for the past few months. What's happening in Pokrovsk? We're receiving too much conflicting information, and you are one of those analysts who knows how to separate the wheat from the chaff. The truth about the real situation, separated from propaganda, psychological operations, and defeatist talk like everything is lost.
I can say this, Pokrovsk is not encircled. That's the first point. The second point, Pokrovsk is not fully controlled by the Russian occupiers. But there is the fact that Russian occupation forces fully control the southern part of Pokrovsk, meaning everything along the M30 highway. They control about 90% of the central districts of Pokrovsk, that is from the M30 to the railway. And they are trying to break through into the northern part of Pokrovsk, which is fully controlled by Ukrainian forces. Ukraine is holding the defense in Pokrovsk in the northern districts. When Russia claims that Pokrovsk is supposedly fully controlled by their forces, this is simply not true at all. I would even say that the situation in Pokrovsk is more stabilized and predictable than in Mirnohrad, which is nearby. Because the Russians are only now beginning the most active phase of offensive assault operations in Mirnohrad. And mainly all these efforts are concentrated in the southern part, in the southern area of the city itself. They are trying to encircle precisely the area where the Shakti Dimitrova telecommunication center is located. And apparently they intend to advance along the former street, or what could be considered Tolbukin Avenue. In other words, they are trying to cut off the south of Mirnohrad from its central and northern parts. Therefore, as of today, we can say that the fighting there continues. And all those statements that we are hearing from the Russians today, whether from propagandists or any of their representatives, individuals or officials who might make such statements at the political level, they do not correspond to reality.
And how long can the situation remain like this? Because the occupiers have been trying to take Pokrovsk for over a year now, and they've already reported capturing it several times, even claiming full control on several occasions, completely.
A lot here depends on a whole range of factors. In my opinion, logistics is a very important factor. If Ukraine's defense forces in the near future are able in the Dobropilye direction, where counteroffensive actions have been taking place since August this year to push back, we could actually force the Russians onto the left bank of the Kazeni Torets. That is away from Rodinske, from Krasny Lyman, yes. This will significantly improve our logistics and the supply of our garrisons. To the north of Pokrovsk and in Mirnohrad, if this does not happen, then I think, frankly speaking, in the first quarter of 2026, we will lose control over Pokrovsk.
Well, let's hope that doesn't happen. And what about the fact that the enemy is transferring so-called elite units to the Pokrovsk area? How should we interpret this news? Is this them reinforcing, or is it happening out of desperation on the part of the Russian occupation forces?
They don't have any elite units as of today. If we measure the concept of elite as it was understood in 2022, what were those units? Those were, first and foremost, units of their main directorate, the GU, the General Staff, the Special Operations Forces of the Russian Federation. These were essentially their units that were strictly subordinated, their groups. These are the alpha units of the FSB and others like them. The airborne forces, the Marines, these are already the second or third tier. And by 2022, the main elite, who had years of experience, including in different climate zones and various combat conditions, such as Syria, Libya, Georgia, and Donbass. In the end, in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, where they also carried out their operations, all of this was already ground up in this, the meat grinder of war. What they now call the elite, on average, what is that? It's a mobilized conscript who signed a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense and managed to survive for 3 or 4 months. That's what they call the elite. This is not an elite special forces soldier. So if we're talking about the assault component, that's roughly what it looks like. Those who are sent to the slaughter from day one, and those who manage to survive for several months.
Well, to survive, especially in the Pokrovsk direction for several months, that really is probably a sign of being elite for the Russian army. Alexander, how much longer can they keep sending them to the slaughter? On your Telegram channel, you were one of the first to point this out, by the way. I recommend all our viewers subscribe to Alexander Kovalenko's Telegram channel. There's very high quality and timely analysis there. Always, not just about the war, but also about geopolitics. You were one of the first to point out that the number of 200s already exceeds 60 to 65% among the Russian occupiers. These are irrecoverable losses. At this pace of burning through manpower, how much longer can they keep it up? They've run out of convicts, and as for alcoholics, well, probably not yet.
No, the question is different here. What legislative tools will be used within Russia itself? Right now, we can see that these tools are being made as strict as possible within Russia itself. For example, year-round conscription, mandatory conscription, that is, we're talking about conscripts here. Currently, legislative projects are being carried out. And there is a proposal to tie reservists to fully securing the rear. Fully securing the rear means freeing up regular troops, the same contract soldiers or even conscripts. Next, they are scaling up recruitment in third world countries. Africa, Central Asia, and the Americas, again, Latin America and even Kurds, for example, are all included. Cuba, Nicaragua, and so on, they are mobilizing these resources. Then there are the actions of the Russian Investigative Committee, the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation. They are now trying as much as possible to bring so-called Russian naturalized citizens into the combat zone who are naturalized Russians. In their understanding, these are migrants from Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and so on, who have obtained citizenship of the Russian Federation. As soon as they receive Russian citizenship, they immediately become liable for military service. And Russian bailiffs come to them right away. First of all, it's not even so much the military enlistment office, but specifically the investigative committee of the Russian Federation that mobilizes them. In May of this year in St. Petersburg, Bystrikin, the head of the investigative committee, he reported that since the beginning of 2025, 80,000 arrests have been made for failure to comply with the rules for registering naturalized citizens for military service. And 30,000 were sent to the combat zone during this period. What does this mean? It means that the investigative committee of the Russian Federation is now acting as a kind of overseer, sending all migrants who have obtained Russian citizenship to the combat zone this year. This figure will exceed 80,000. These are catastrophic figures for those citizens who leave in search of a future, prosperity, to somehow make a life for themselves. For them, it's simply a one-way ticket to the war in Ukraine. Frankly, and I apologize, but they're just being turned into cannon fodder. They will simply be used as assault troops. And unfortunately, there's another very negative aspect. This is the fact that through legislative means, Russia is now implementing year-round mobilization for conscripts. They're trying to do this gradually. And in 2026, I'm even sure this will happen. at the level of obligations for Ministry of Defense contract soldiers. That is, a conscript will be, in terms of obligations, comparable to contract soldiers. And essentially, this is a combat unit that can be used in the temporarily occupied territories. Therefore, unfortunately, they have a large number. They have a human resource that they will direct specifically to the war in Ukraine, since the classic methods of conducting offensive operations, combat actions, that is, with equipment, tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, all of that has been neutralized. In 2022, 2023, and 2024, we have exhausted Russia to the maximum in this regard. Now, Russia can wage war mainly thanks to its human resources. This is their main tool now.
All right, they'll have enough cannon fodder, but what about everything else? Well, as you said, they're using much less equipment now, several times less. How long will their actual money last? Today, Bill wrote that the Russian Federation still has resources for up to 18 months, or is it impossible to calculate?
About 17 months? Well, all right, I can't fully and directly agree with that specific data. 18 months, that's a full year and a half, right? Indeed, that's a significant period of time. Next year, Russia will need at least 1 million people as a human resource. Just next year alone, 1 million people. And that's a very important indicator. We see multiple verifications of how much Russian manpower is being destroyed on the battlefield. Just recently, even Moda published a video showing Russians near the moat at the crossing trying to get out somehow. As they tried to get beyond that moat, they were hit. A camel was destroyed by a drone strike. A camel is slang for a porter in the Russian army, someone who carries ammunition. And there were about 30 Russian bodies, Russian occupiers in the area, 30 people in one location, in an area of 20 by 20 meters. 30 people. That's a platoon. And here's the most interesting part. They're not removed from these areas. They're not evacuated. The bodies of the dead, they just stay there. And those dead, who do they remain as? Listed as missing in action. There are a huge number of missing persons in Russia right now. They can keep up this pace. They can keep taking, and they don't have to report the deaths, the KIAs. They can count them as wounded instead. But again, there's a very interesting point. A wounded soldier in the combat zone, they just leave him there. They don't evacuate him, and he ends up becoming fertilizer for the Ukrainian black soil. Why? Because a wounded soldier means compensation payments. But if he isn't evacuated and dies there, he becomes a KIA. And what does that mean? It means he's missing in action. We don't know what happened to him, who he is. And in this way, Russia is saving not just millions, but tens of billions every month, simply by not evacuating the bodies of their dead from the combat zone. A very important point. Recently, Russia has started exchanging our dead for their own dead. We've noticed this, but they used it as an information psychological operation, which consisted of the following, namely that they return 1,000 bodies to us, while we return 30, 40, maybe 50 bodies. They draw conclusions from this, as if to say, we killed 1,000 Ukrainians. The Ukrainians returned 30, 40, maybe 50 dead Russians to us. This doesn't reflect reality at all, for the simple reason that the Russians are advancing, so they have the opportunity to collect the bodies of our fallen much faster than we can retrieve our own, let alone Russian bodies. And as for the Russians, they don't collect their own at all, literally not at all. That's why this imbalance occurs. It's manipulation. They're trying to manipulate these numbers. Whoever is advancing always has the opportunity to carry out the necessary evacuation operations in that territory, much more effectively than those who are retreating. While we are in a state of strategic defense, we can't afford to do that. But they take advantage of this. At the same time, their losses are still dozens of times greater than ours. The only difference is that it's more beneficial for them. For their information campaigns, it's more advantageous to return our bodies to us, our fallen, but not to retrieve their own. Even though they have so many bodies that the cemeteries across the Russian Federation would simply turn into...
would be overflowing. As it is, the coffin business, so to speak, the funeral industry, is simply thriving across the Russian Federation. They are among the beneficiaries of this war. You are talking about manipulations in these statistics. The most frustrating thing is that our partner, who is still officially dancing to the tune of the Russian Federation, relies on this manipulation lately. And in fact, they are now demanding that Zelensky surrender Donbass. But even relying on your analysis, one wonders what they are operating with and what they are basing these demands for such concessions on. But that's not what I wanted to ask about. Not about this sad news, but about what Macron and Merz said today, who stated that Ukraine and the European Union have a lot of cards to play. What does the European Union have today that could really radically change the situation? And a rhetorical question, why haven't they matured to this point yet?
The European Union's main card is its support for Ukraine, stable, unwavering, constant, unchanging. And for Ukraine, it's profoundly important that we have the unwavering courage to stand up to the powerful Russian Federation, to decisively do what no one else would ever truly dare to do. Paris, Berlin, London, Rome, anyone really from any nation would hesitate. We can twist the Russian Federation into such a tight knot, a ram's horn, in a way they would never allow themselves to be treated. And that's why it's so important for them to support us. And then we'll handle everything else, because the truth lies in a simple, unwavering dogma. Today, Ukraine truly is the main barrier protecting Europe from the Russian aggressor. If there is no Ukraine, there will be no Europe. And Europe, as of today, no one will defend it.
I'm also more than certain that the only thing Putin regrets today is that he didn't start with Europe or the NATO countries. And thank God that Europe and the NATO countries are only just now starting to realize this. Thank you so much, Alexander, for your analysis, for always finding time to speak with our viewers. Let me remind you to please subscribe to Alexander Kovalenko's Telegram channel to get up-to-date analysis on a daily basis. Thank you very much, Alexander Kovalenko, military analyst, for joining us. Until next time.
All the best.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.